All right, I think we're gonna get started. I squared. Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Lena, and it is my honor to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Ledger here today. She's here in person, and I'm very excited that we'll get to chat with her. She is a professor of biology and a director of the Museum of Natural History at the University of Nevada, Reno. And last year, she was named Foundation Professor for Extraordinary Record of her achievements at the university. She earned her BA at Lewis and Clark College and her PhD at UC Davis. Dr. Ledger is a leading plant ecologist whose research program focuses on restoration and ecology of native plants of the Great Basin. Her work spans from local adaptation and evolution of plants to plant and herbivore interactions and their effects on plant communities. She works closely with the Bureau of Land Management and strategically tackles the most pressing issues in native plant restoration in the Great Basin. And I've been following her work for some years now, and I've been very impressed by the way she effectively communicates her science to managers and scientists to directly impact management and restoration decisions. We're honored to have her here. And one quick plug before I pass this mic to her. We're having a bring your own lunch in-person meeting after the seminar outside the science library. So if you're here in person, please join us. With that, please welcome Dr. Ledger.
Yay, thank you so much. And thank you, Lena, for being such a fabulous host. The whole time I'm here, she's been picking me up and dragging me around. It's been great. And thanks to all of you for being here in person, and thanks to those of you on Zoom. Hello. This is the first time I've gone anywhere for any sort of speaking engagement since 2019. And we were like, touch and go, are we going to do this? And then finally it was like, you know what, let's just do this. So I'm super happy to be here. So thank you. And am I still too loud in the room? Are you okay?
Oh, it says there's an echo.
Yeah, there is a little bit of an echo.
In the Zoom. Did you ask people on Zoom?
Is it gone? Can you still hear the echo? Are we good?
Someone say something?
Yeah, Zoom folks. Is it okay? Okay. Echo is not bad, a little hard to hear though.
Have we got?
Does somebody have their, is it me?
Sorry, could you just open up?
Yeah.
Yeah, the, aha. Yeah, try same system.
How's that? Yes? Great. Great. Yeah, that's better here too. Wonderful. All these things we're learning. Okay, well, thank you again. And I'm super happy to talk to you about the research that I've been doing in the Great Basin. It's been about 15 years now, so I'm going to try and cover 15 years in 50 minutes, which I believe is possible. And I am going to be talking to you about evolutionary history and how we can incorporate what we learned from evolution in ecological restoration. When I first started doing my work on ecological restoration and evolution, I used to have to spend time convincing people that evolution was something that can happen on rapid timescales. It was not until sort of the 1970s and 1980s that people really began to understand that ecology and evolution could interact in real time to create meaningful change in wild populations. And this classic example from Peter and Rosemary Grant, the ecological finches, is a great example of that. This was one of the first times that people really documented evolutionary change in a wild population. This really famous diagram is the distribution of beak sizes on the particular island before a drought. And then after drought, they went and measured beak size after this really strong selection event. And they saw in one generation shifting in beak size. And this was really news, right? That ecology and evolution could really interact this rapidly. Since then, however, there's been this great synthesis between ecology and evolutionary dynamics, and I no longer have to convince people that it's true. We have a lot of great reviews looking at how we've learned from natural systems, and we've learned a lot about rapid evolution from invasive species. When you introduce invaders into a new habitat, that's an awesome opportunity to learn about rapid evolution. So we've learned a lot from these weeds. And we're now sort of more getting into the mechanisms behind rapid evolutionary change. So an example of Darwin's finches, we're now figuring out that it's potentially just a single gene of large effect that controls beak size in these animals. So not just can it happen, but how and where. So that's pretty fun. So the great thing for me is that it's really freed up the first part of my talk. I don't have to be so, stuck on convincing people that rapid evolution is going to happen.
Don't mind me.
Okay. But I can talk about other things that are maybe not so well understood. And so, second, can you guys hear me?
They say it's echoing a little bit.
Okay. Good. You can still hear me? Yes, great. So today I'm going to talk about some things that maybe are not quite so familiar to some of you, but certainly familiar to the Hallett Lab. I'm going to talk about restoration in the Great Basin, which is sufficiently unusual that I think it's worth spending some time on, because I'm from California, and when I realized what was going on in the Great Basin, I was completely amazed. I'm going to spend some time after that talking about how we can learn from contemporary evolution, talking about a few examples. I'm going to talk about traits that help plants establish in these really disturbed sites. I'm going to talk about an experiment one of my very first grad students did, measuring natural selection during restoration. I'm going to look at some evidence of evolution in response to invasion. We're going to ask some questions about how plants from different locations function together. And then rather than it being like separate sections, like I said, I work really closely with land managers, and I'm going to probably not be able to stop myself from talking about implications for land management throughout this talk, because I really strongly want to do work that really affects what we do on the ground. Okay, so here we are, right, in our Western United States. We're on the west side over here, right now. And what I wanted to show you was my sort of adopted home state, Nevada, is very, very heavily managed by the Bureau of Land Management. That's the color in yellow. The outline of the Great Basin, which is basically, I'm going to show you the next slide, basically corresponds to the outline of the habitat managed by the Bureau of Land Management. Eastern Oregon as well is very similar. We go up into Idaho and into Utah, but Nevada in particular is this like very heart of the Great Basin, lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And here's that corresponding map of the Great Basin Floristic Province. Whenever I give this talk somewhere that's wet, I always make a joke about how the Great Basin is shown in brown, and that's because it's very dry, right? Like this is a very appropriate color for this floristic province. In Eugene, you get about 1,000 millimeters of precip a year, more than that even. The average in the Great Basin is between 150 millimeters and 300 millimeters, which is super, super dry. And so again, it's very, very dry, much different from the western part of the states. If you haven't spent time out there, it's actually quite gorgeous. I know people like trees, but if you can get into small plants, the Great Basin is magical. This is a picture of an ecosystem that's actually in really great shape. You have a nice shrub component, you have perennial grasses, you have perennial forbs, you probably have some nice annual forbs in here. And there's lots of places in the Great Basin that still look like this, that are relatively intact, and it's delightful to find them. Unfortunately, there's a lot of places that look like this, where you still maintain that shrub overstory. These are not delicious, and so grazing animals tend to not eat the sagebrush. But what they have eaten in here, we have the understory of those really tasty perennial forbs and grasses. In this particular setting, it has been grazed out, and it has been replaced with our arch enemy, cheatgrass, Bromus textorum, right, the annual grass that really loves this kind of situation. It's super flammable, unfortunately, and when you get this understory, overstory combination, you can have these explosive fires that burn out of control. And after those fires, you can transition what was a shrub-dominated community into a pretty sad annual grassland. Folks in here, do you want me to turn the lights off? Can you see these? It's just an ugly grassland, but I see that it's a little walk back.
It's over here.
Yeah, I don't know if that. Anyway, it's pretty bad. So it was shrubs, and now it's mostly grass. Now in the dark, but there, we're back. Okay. And over here on this map on the right, this is the image from Bradley et al. Estimated cover of cheatgrass across sort of the Great Basin and beyond. Any pixel that's gray, it's about a 15% cover of cheatgrass. And that's actually really significant. Any cheatgrass cover over 5% has a really strong probability of burning. So it's quite invaded, especially in sort of more northern areas. So the Bureau of Land Management manages a lot of this land. And after these fires, they go in and they do sort of rehabilitation seedings at the scale that, to me, coming from California, where 1 mile by 1 mile was like a big restoration. The scale of the seedings that are being done by the BLM is unbelievable. So this is a person driving a tractor, dragging 3 different seed drills across one of these fires. Each of these has seeds up here, and this person is dragging them. They're planting in the ground like crops. This contractor is probably going to drive this for 2 to 3 weeks, just like day in, day out, putting seeds out on the ground. This is the Milford Flat Fire. That was Utah's biggest fire. It burned in 2007. And it was the biggest fire at that time. And just to put some of this in perspective, I showed you that map of the yellow land that the Bureau of Land Management manages. They put seeds on the ground in this unbelievable volume. So this is the millions, yes, millions of pounds of seeds put in the ground by the Bureau of Land Management in these different years. This is a little snapshot. You can see that following wet years, we have tons of fire and tons of seeding, and it's very cyclic, right? After drought, we don't burn, and then we burn again. But over this little snapshot, the Bureau of Land Management has, 43 million pounds of seed to the tune of, $254 million of seed put in the ground. The Bureau of Land Management is actually the largest seed buyer in the Western Hemisphere. They buy more seeds than ag. They buy a lot of seeds. And when I first moved here, I was really excited to go see some of these sites because I've never heard of such a scale. So this was one of the first fires I went to. This was in 2006. This is in eastern Nevada. And these rows of plants, this is not rows of very expensive plants. These are rows of cheatgrass, which really enjoyed that furrow process. There are native plants in here, but they're very few and far between. This is not what I was expecting to see. You get a lot of failures in these really dry sites. Here's just one example. This is that Milford Flat Fire that I showed you. This was $25 million spent rehabbing the single fire, which as a researcher, always like scrapping for my change. I look at that number and I just think, can we just have a tiny bit of that? 5 years after the fire, perennial grass cover, which is a lot of what's seeded here, was less than 2% in these treated areas, and importantly, not different from areas that they didn't seed. So like things did not establish. And they're trying to keep these annual weeds out. That didn't work. They were equal or higher in areas that they seeded, right? So this is a super expensive failure. There's a lot of examples of this, unfortunately. You do get plants sometimes. I always sort of shorthand it to like maybe 1% of the seeds that we put on the ground turn into plants. It might be higher than that, it might be lower than that, but that's about a good estimate. So why, right? Well, remember the brown slide in the beginning? Like, it's dry in these systems. So, you simply, in a perennial system, don't necessarily expect native plants to establish from seed every year. That's not how they evolved. Sagebrush is estimated to recruit every 20 to 30 years, like successfully from seed. So we're asking these plants to do something that's quite different than what they usually do. We're asking them to start from seed every year without fail. So that's hard. We do get success when it's wetter, and that's about every 6 to 7 years. We get these sort of wet cycles. So That's just challenging. Another thing that my next slides are about, I think that there's some pretty strong evidence that we're using when we're putting this, $254 million worth of seed on the ground, that we could be doing a better job matching the genotypes we're putting out there with the environment where they're growing. So I'm going to show you a little bit of information about that. So Nevada seeds, right? I'm focused on Nevada because it's easy to get information by state offices, by state BLM offices. So just focusing on Nevada seeds. You look at what we plant, most of it is grass. The vast majority of what's going on the ground is grass. They're mostly not wild collected. They're mostly farm-grown cultivars or named varieties. These are wild collections that have been chosen for some reason. And you simply couldn't plant the pounds and pounds of seed you need from wild collections. They do need to go through this agricultural increase process. So they're almost all farm-raised seeds. And quite surprising to me, especially coming from Kevin Rice's lab at UC Davis, right? Local, right? These things are not sourced from the Great Basin. Not from Nevada, but not from the Great Basin. So this is a map of the source, the original source location for about 8 different species of grasses that are planted a lot in the Great Basin. So every star represents a collection that if you're a land manager in Nevada, you can buy and seed on your fires. You can see that there's only one collection that's from northeastern Nevada. And Lena, I know you know what this one is. Toe Jam, yeah. It has the super unfortunate name of Toe Jam Creek squirrel tail, so that's awkward. But but it is one plant, one squirrel tail that you can buy that was even sourced from Nevada. And you can see that most of these are not, this green outline is the Great Basin Floristic Province. Most of them are sourced from outside the Great Basin. There's some historical reasons for this, but if you know anything about local adaptation, this is not what you do. You do not move things from wet areas to dry areas and expect them to grow. If you know anything about climate change, this is not what you do. You're not going to take things from the north and move them south. Maybe if all these stars were down here, that would make some sense. But we're flying in the face of everything we know about local adaptation and climate change with this super expensive thing that we're doing every year. So again, again, scratching my head, what is going on? Why are these particular collections being, used so widely? What are the traits that people are selecting for? And so I had my absolutely wonderful and bulldog-like grad student, Owen, who will not quit, go through the release information for 90 different grasses, forbs, and shrubs that you can buy if you're, doing large-scale restoration. And I had him count up the number of times different characteristics were mentioned. And the number one character for why we're putting these particular stars on the map is forage yield and forage quality, right? BLM, multiple use, forage is a major priority. This also means very large plants, right? Seed yield. This is important. If you need pounds and pounds of seed, you're going to select things that make pounds and pounds of seed, right? So that is like a major character. Seedling vigor. It took me years to figure out what this is. This is like one of my favorite things. So they, when testing these cultivars, they take a seed, they bury it like 6 inches underground, and they time how long it takes to come up. And then if it comes up, which you never plant a seed that deep, right? But if it comes up, it's very vigorous. And so that gets selected. So if you think about it from a trait perspective, you're selecting for very rapid shoot growth, right? Well, that's weird. Okay, sorry, I can't keep my editorializing out of this, which is why I sometimes ask people not to record it, because here it is. Anyway, so it's not till you get down here where you start seeing things like competitive with exotic annuals, right? I showed you that field site, it's like full of weeds. Maybe we should be thinking about that when we're selecting things. And I will tell you, it's super easy to make fun of other people's practices, right? Like that's what humans do. But it's a lot harder to make your own list of like, okay, I think all that is wrong. What are the list of things that I think we should be using in restoration? And that's where you can start learning from natural selection, right? This is not my opinion. This is evolution's opinion, and we can measure it on the landscape and figure out what actually works. So I'm gonna give you 2 little examples. One I totally love, looking at seeds that survive during restoration. And another one, I'm going to be pretty quick, looking at traits of natural plants that are just naturally surviving in invaded systems. And when we think about those restoration sites where, say, you plant all these seeds and maybe 1% of them actually turns into a plant, is that a random chance? Like, is that 1% actually surviving because it fell into the right little microenvironment? It's like under a rock, it's under a nurse plant. Or are they surviving because they have particular phenotypic traits that are, more fit in that environment than the other plants that didn't survive? That is a kind of key question about restoration, right? Is it random, or is it a particular subset of your seeds that are doing really well? And you can answer this question by doing one of these sort of resurrection experiments, where you compare the traits in that original stuff that's in those drills that they're putting out there, like the giant mix, versus that 1% that survived in the field. Just like Peter and Rosemary Grant, right? Before drought, after drought. Before restoration, after restoration. And you can do this on any restoration on Earth. So this was one of my very first master's students, Sarah Kopa. We now work together all the time, still, which is very fun. So she and I convinced, it was actually the US Forest Service doing this seeding. We convinced them to save a scoop of what was actually going in the drill on the day that they did the experiment in a little bag. And then we went out to those fires and collected seeds from basically the very small number of plants that managed to survive 2 years after the fire. We had them save us the entire mix. And I don't know how good your botany is here. Who knows the red one? Yeah, of course. Who knows this green one? It's squirrel tail. This is that toad squirrel tail, which is enormous. And it's the only one that survived in this fire site. And it's a place in Nevada not too far from the original collection location. So not coincidentally, right, that one cultivar from Nevada is the one that survived here. So we were able to compare characteristics of that squirrel tail to the original collection material. We had bigger plans, but you cannot study things that are dead, So Sarah went out and she collected seeds from 100 randomly selected survivors at 2 different fire sites. And we did that experiment where we compared them to that original sample that we had gotten from the Forest Service. This is my favorite plant. I work with it all the time because it's very cooperative and it grows. Sarah built this amazing watering system from scratch out in our back 40, as I call it. This is our terrible Nevada soil that we get to work with. This is one of my first experiments, and I didn't understand how drought hardy the plants were. I made her build this whole system, and she seeded into it, and we actually never had to turn it on. The plants were able to germinate and grow with just the preset in Nevada. So after she graduated, I took the whole thing and I put it in a dumpster, and I was just like, sorry, I made you build that thing. We'll throw it away. But anyway, it's quite dry. So Sarah took those different seeds, the original and then the survivors, and she grew them for 2 generations. And she measured seed weights going in, and then a couple generations, we looked at plant size, leaf number, seed production, when they came out of the ground, when they flowered. And then I had a different student do a greenhouse study looking at root to shoot allocation. All to ask this $1 million question, or $254 million question. Do we see differences in these traits that in the plants that are surviving? And I'm just going to show you one trait. This is seed size. Again, these are histograms, just like I showed you with the Darwin's fish sheets. So this is the weight of seeds coming out of the farm, basically. This is what the BLM is seeding in the ground. The average seed weight is like 3.8 milligrams. When Sarah collected from the Gopher Fire and the East Humboldt Fire, those seeds were much smaller, like 1 to 2 milligrams. Not too surprising, because this is like a nice happy ag field, and these are like horrible weed-filled Nevada soils, right? So this could be an entirely maternal effect, not a genetic effect, but a maternal effect. So that's why you have to do it for 2 generations. So when Sarah collected the F2s, it was pretty spectacular. What you see is sort of this narrowing of variation, which is what you expect when you grow things in a common garden. And what you see is that, yes, indeed, the seeds from that original field were quite large, and the subset, that 1% that actually survived, it's actually this tiny little, the small seeded tail of that distribution. The difference between these two red bars is the strength of selection in the system. And this is very strong selection against the majority of things that are going in the field and towards this tiny little subset of seeds. It's kind of unbelievable. And I'll tell you that this size is more, we've now collected and measured seed weights across the Great Basin. This is more typically what you see in a wild collection. This is this sort of average. I think the average LMS size is 2.33 milligrams. I'm not kidding you, across the Great Basin. So like these plants really know what works. And it's not these giant seeds. It's kind of fabulous. When I talk about this with managers, I tell them that you want this distance between these red bars to be as small as possible, because that represents wasted money, right? You want the seed going in to be exactly on par with what survives in your site. And if that's not happening, you're wasting money, right? So kind of fun. Sarah, she did it for 3 generations because she's that person. And these results are consistent with selection for smaller seeds in this restoration setting, which I have to tell you is not what I expected. I'm not going to show you all of her results, but it wasn't just smaller seeds. The plants themselves were smaller. They made seeds earlier, they emerged earlier, and they had a greater root allocation. So it was this very correlated suite of traits that was favored in the wild. And we don't actually know which of these traits was the one that really is under selection. It's very difficult to tease apart for these selfing plants. But we found to us was rather surprising that rather than being big, being small and fast was the way to survive in this invaded site. You could literally do this in every restoration on Earth, and you could really first you could learn a lot about natural selection in the wild, fluctuating cross gradients, but you could also stop wasting money buying seeds that don't grow. So kind of love that. Another thing that we did to sort of come with our list of traits that we think work in these invaded environments is to do this sort of natural experiment and just look at plants that are naturally surviving in invaded sites. I showed you some pictures of truly horrible places, it's just all weeds, but there's a lot of the Great Basin that looks more like this. That's like kind of a nice mix between invaded background and some natives growing with them. It's not totally gone. There are still these little native plants surviving. And you can ask that same question. Are these plants surviving because they are the 1%, right? They have the characteristics that help them survive. Or is this just random chance and this population is going to wink out just like the rest? Unlike Sarah's experiment, we can't go back 100 years and get the sample of the genotypes that used to be here, right? Like that's gone. So you can't do that before and after comparison to ask this question. But what you can do is this sort of space for time sort of thing, where you can compare plants growing in invaded areas and compare their traits with plants growing in nearby uninvaded areas to ask if there's been evolutionary change. So what you're looking at here, this is a fire boundary. Somebody dropped fire retardant right here and like stopped this fire in its tracks. There's a bulldozer line right here, right? So you very artificially stopped a fire right in the middle of this population. So, and you can see over here, this is sort of the yellow of cheatgrass and this is sort of the green of sagebrush. So you can find these places and you can ask that same question. Do these plants over here have characteristics that are different from plants over here? I'll tell you, people hate this experiment. They hate natural experiments. They're just going to get in your face about all the things that could possibly be going on that you didn't control for. And it's like, yes, show me your record of the genotypes that were here 100 years ago, and I will totally do something else. But since we don't have that, this works. Reviewers hate it. Don't do it, okay? Just if you're a grad student or thinking about grad work, unless you want to fight for the rest of your life, don't do this. It's just true. So, but we, okay, foolhardy. We found a bunch of these locations where we had this invaded, uninvaded barriers next to each other. We found 5 perennial grasses growing there, delightful little plants. We dug them up from the wild. This is one of those invaded sites. So you can dig up these perennial grasses when they're dormant and they don't care. It's really wonderful, very tractable. So we dug them up from invaded areas. We dug them up from the relatively uninvaded areas nearby. And we asked this question, right? Are those plants growing with weeds? Are they more competitive than sort of their naive neighbors? And if so, why. This is really the shortest results section ever. Yes, in 3 of those 5 spots, we found that plants growing with weeds were more competitive with cheatgrass. Not everywhere. I mean, natural selection is not perfect. There's all kinds of things that affect the ability of plants to evolve. Diversity, gene flow, drift, all sorts of things. But we did find in some cases, we could find super competitive plants. Here's a great example. So this is Elamis multicetus, another one of my favorite plants. And this is from one of those experiments where we put them all in a pot. The native, each bar here is a single plant that we dug up from the wild. And then this is, we invaded those pots with cheatgrass. And this is how big the cheatgrass got. So low numbers are good. It means that these plants really suppressed the cheatgrass down here, whereas these cheatgrass grew pretty big. And I coded them by color. So those sort of more experienced plants are red, and the unexperienced plants are blue. And at this particular site, those red plants growing with weeds are doing a super job of suppressing cheatgrass in this competitive scenario. Whereas the blue sort of naive populations are kind of letting it get ahead, right? But the cool thing is you can see even in that blue area, there is that genetic variation necessary for selection to act, right? Selection cannot act if you don't have blue plants down here. But this particular population was perfect for selection to push whatever characteristics those are towards the suppressive end. So it's super cool. So if you're a land manager, you could just stop here and be like, well, I want these plants, right? Like, I don't know why, but this is obviously, I do not want these plants. I do want these plants. The ability to suppress cheatgrass could be one of your criteria, right? Things like real red stars on the map. But since I'm a nerd, I want to know why, right? Like, yes, that's great. And I want to know why. So we did a ton of work, different kinds of experiments, looking at what traits help our natives actually survive. And again, this is 15 years of my life, 6 bullet points here. But we found over and over again evidence for these characteristics really helping native grasses do well with cheatgrass. So greening up early, the minute it starts raining, you need to start making leaves. Flowering early, germinating early if you're a seed, putting more energy into roots, particular root characteristics, I'm not going to get into, and again, being small. And if you remember that slide I showed you about the reasons why we're picking cultivars, it's like the complete opposite of this, right? We've been picking giant plants that make a lot of leaves. We're finding that you need to pick small plants that make a lot of roots, okay? Ouch. I think I'm going to skip that next slide because I want to have time for the end here. So I just want to talk a little bit more about roots. They're totally miserable to steady. Anyone in here steady roots? Yeah, right? High five. It sucks. But in the desert, it's really important because all the plants have enough light. Like there's no competition for light, no problem. All the competition in the resource acquisition that is contentious is going on below ground. So this is an amazing picture of an excavation some intrepid person did below a cheatgrass monoculture, and this is a meter stick. This person dug out the soil between the cheatgrass roots. And basically, cheatgrass creates this unbelievable network of roots that suck up every single atom of nitrogen, phosphorus, water, you name it, in the soil. Like this plant is ridiculous below ground. And the natives have to deal with this, right? And it's quite extraordinary. And so we found that what they do with their roots really matters. And here I'm going to show you a fun example of that. Again, using my favorite plant, squirrel tail. We drove around. This is an easy loop to drive. Easy, relatively easy loop to drive. So we do this all the time. We collected squirrel tail from across this loop. From 70 to 100 plants per population. And we grew them out and described a bunch of things about those populations. So we looked at seed size, how long it took them to come out of the ground. This is all in a greenhouse. We found that just looking at the characteristics of 10-day-old plants is pretty effective at figuring out whether they're going to live or die. They're only about like 5 to 6 inches at this point, so it's pretty easy to do. So we did that. We grew them on for 10 days, root length, root diameter, root little tips, we looked at size, root shoot, SRL. And this was a super dry year, so we could actually only spare 20 seeds per population to sort of characterize all the diversity in that population, which I was like, well, that's ridiculous, but it's all we can do. We'll just give it a whirl. But yeah, so with that sort of hilariously small effort, we found what I always find, which is variation in phenotypic traits in wild populations. So each dot is one of those populations. And I've just graphed two things here. So this is 10-day root length, and this is the average diameter. You can find a population with really long roots, or really short fat roots, or sort of medium, there's all kinds of variability in here. So if you're a manager, or if natural selection is acting, there's a lot here to work with, a whole array of things. So after characterizing those populations, we put them out in these 5 different blue dots, putting more of our effort into seeding out in the wild. Most seeds die, so you have to put a lot of seeds in the ground to really get any sort of response. We found these horrible sites, super invaded cheatgrass, gorgeous skies, right? So if you look up, it's beautiful, and then if you look down, it's trashed. That's sort of the Great Basin. We usually plant these in the fall so that we can, this is like end of October, so we can pick up the first rains. We do this ridiculous gluing seeds on toothpicks so that we can track individual seeds. The soils are so bad that we had to innovate this hilarious method. Like drill seeding, right? This works really well. Otherwise, you're going to pop the seeds off your toothpick as you're trying to shove in the ground because it's that hard. So we go out and we monitor in the fall, and then we monitor through the summer. And sort of the question, of those 35 populations, do we see any differences in how they survive? This is like the happiest plant that grew in the entire thing. So this is by far not, and there's no cheatgrass here. This is not normal. Usually they look terrible. But you can see they can get pretty big if they have an opportunity. And what we found was that, yes, there was huge variation among our plants. This is just in whether or not they were actively growing in June. So were they photosynthesizing in June, which is a measure of happiness, really. So you can see that some of them, and this is averaged across those 5 sites, some of them are doing pretty well, right? They're still green in June, that's amazing. And some of them are not doing so well. They're more brown, probably dead. Here's our favorite toe jam, actually, right here in the middle. This is that one cultivar, right, from northeastern Nevada. So it's not the best, but it's not the worst. But the fun thing is, right, there are these populations that look like they might be better at surviving in the wild. So again, if you're a manager, you can be like, well, I want to pull from this end of the spectrum. Looks like they can still grow even in really hot, dry places. But again, I'm a nerd, so I want to know why. It's not enough to find them. Then you have to explain why. And I had a guess, but I have to tell you that when I made this next graph, this was like the most triumphant moment in my whole career, and probably I should have just retired at that point because it won't get better than this. So this is the correlation between each population's 10-day root length, averaged from 20 seeds, okay, against the average presence in June across these 5 sites, so summed across these 5 sites. And the measurement that we did about root length, predicting that presence, is unbelievable, right? That is like unbelievable. It almost makes you feel like you learned something, right? But having long roots at 10 days, it's a really good way to not die in the desert. And when I put it that way, it seems really obvious, because obviously that's a great way to not die. But it was like amazing, right? And then if we just add 2 more things, so seed size and emergence time, you can get the R-square of that model up to like 0.66, which I'm sorry, that has never happened to me in my entire life, anything, let alone something this sort of diffuse and nebulous. So this makes me feel super great. Like we actually have pretty good evidence of what traits we should be selecting for in restoration of these weedy places. Roots, early emergence, it's pretty great. So summarizing that part, every restoration can be an experiment, right? If you save seeds going in, seeds going out, you can describe the traits that are adaptive at your site. It's pretty easy. Sometimes you can find these invaded populations where you can collect seeds from, and they can be great sources for restoration. We tend to go to the most pristine areas, right, and collect from those. but actually it's probably great to go to these invaded places sometimes. This should be obvious, but we shouldn't make lists of traits that we care about based on our opinion. We should use field studies to figure out why. And if you are very observant, you've probably noticed that I started this talk talking about communities and grasses and forbs, and then I just spent the last like 45 minutes telling you about grass, right? And are you like, okay, but what about shrubs and forbs, right? Lena, what time? I forgot to ask what time you're sort of aiming for. Great. Because that's what I want. So I've been working on grass, and most particularly this grass, because it grows, right? And yet, that is not the goal of restoration. It's a field full of squirrel tail. And I actually had a conversation with the manager, and she was like, somebody who loves crested wheatgrass, which is an introduced grass, and she raised her hand and said, is there a squirrel tail that can take the place of crested wheatgrass in our rangeland seeding? And I was like, oh, I guess I have to, no. Like the community is much more diverse. I use squirrel tail as a tool because it's cooperative and you can learn from it, but the community is not squirrel tail, and I need to realize I needed to move beyond my comfort zone. So we picked up sagebrush, rabbitbrush. These are erigerons, which are delightful, connectus, which is great, Thurber's needlegrass, and Poa secunda, also big players. And my fantastic PhD student, Allison Andre, who graduated from the University of Oregon. She has a Bachelor of Science from here. She took botany, baby Roy, and it changed her life. She worked on the Mimulus project. She worked on ants. And anyway, she is now in love with the Great Basin. She's about to take this very exciting job that I cannot talk about because it's not final yet. But anyway, Allison, the fabulous, was brave enough to take on this whole thing, right? I did all this work for one plant. Allison was like, bring it on. Let's do 7. Why not? And so Allison's questions were these. Okay, so I've done a great job describing what traits help grasses survive. Can we figure out what traits help shrubs and forbs survive in the wild? Is it going to be the same sort of thing? Or are there different strategies for shrubs and forbs? Are there particular places where, for whatever reason, the historic conditions have led to really awesome populations of everything? So remember, some of my populations had evolved in response to cheatgrass, some had not. Are there places that, due to their size, or gene flow, or history of fire, or history of grazing, or their climate, for some reason, there's been selection such that everyone there is really good at establishing from seed? If that's true, that would be really handy. You could just really not have to test every single plant, but test for a particular location and then collect everybody from there. And then finally, this nagging question that has been bothering me. So I'm a population ecologist, but communities are not made of populations, right? These are not non-interacting forces. And so I started worrying that if I went around the world like a population ecologist being like, I know what makes this one tick, I know what this one likes, I know what this one likes, I know what this one likes. At the point where we were creating a restoration mix, putting all those things together might be a total disaster, right? Like if I found all the most competitive versions of all of these plants and put them in a drill, is that like founding an island full of lawyers? Do you know what I mean? Like this could be a horrible idea. My idea that we're going to go around and describe and catalog who's best, put them all in a drill and just call it a community, right? Maybe that's a terrible idea. So before I go too far on the community, I really want to think about how these plants function together, which is a very new place for my brain, I have to tell you. So Allison very bravely took this on. She drove our favorite loop. She collected all 7 of these taxa from the red triangles. So these are very similar sites, similar precip, similar soils. Very hard to find places where all 7 of these plants grow together. So she also sort of padded them with some secondary sites where she collected just a couple of them. So we have 16 sites where everyone is there, and then we have some others as well. She planted them out at these common gardens. So these little purple things, so one in Reno and then a couple others. And then she also had to do a little bit of this in the greenhouse because a lot of the shrubs and forbs just would not come out of the ground. So we had to sort of do some greenhouse trials as well. So again, it's the same question that I was asking. Who survives and why? But not just for squirrel tail, but for all of these taxa. So this woman just did it, I gotta tell you, right? So much root washing, so much tomography, it was like kind of insane. Such that this next slide, really, you have to appreciate how hard this was for Alice. So down here, we've got our forbs and our grasses and our shrubs, and she grew them for different ages, so that's why some of them are in here a couple times. We had a couple different gardens, so you don't have to totally worry about these labels, but these are all of our different species, and then these are all of our different characteristics, and we line them all up. The size of the circle is the strength of the correlation. Red is it's positive, it helps you survive. Blue is it's negative, it helps you survive if it was small. And so you can kind of line these up and squint. And you can see days to emergence across everybody in all gardens tends to be blue, consistent with this, early emergence is good across these species, not just squirrel tail, my favorite here, but everybody else too. You can also sort of squint and see that there's some red going on here, especially for some of our forbs. That root mass really helps survive, but there is variability. And then also sort of a commonality that seed weight, bigger seeds tend to help you survive. Again, this is not like the giant seed of the toe jam creek squirrel tail. This is more like the 2.5 milligram seed. So not like outrageously large, but like pretty good. And then you can also see there's some sort of specific things for different species, which are different. But it's kind of like, okay, yes, we can describe there are some commonalities in these species. So that's cool. And then the second question, are there places on Earth where everybody is above average, right? The Lake Wobegon phenomenon. So what I've graphed here is relative survival of each of these different 16 collections, sites where we have everybody. If you're above the line, that means this was an above the line Thurbers. This was a quite successful Connectus, right? This is a really great Elemis. And we've kind of lined them up for sort of average performance at each site. And, rather than one site being amazing, except for maybe this one where everybody is above average, and this one where everybody is below average, there's kind of a lot of variability, right? So it's not really supporting the idea that every single plant had the same selection regime that was selecting for amazing survival from seed. Unless you're at Peavine Low, which is right outside of Reno, and I love this mountain, and it's very disturbed and it's full of weeds. People light it on fire all the time. Heavy grazing history, and everybody is pretty above average there. So that's, it's not super strong, but maybe Peavine is a great source of seeds. Okay, and then the third question, the lawyer question, right? Given what we know, what should we do to combine these plants into communities, right? And put them out on the landscape. So given this information, there's 4 different kinds of communities you could make. You could just take the absolute best of every species, irrespective of where it's from, the best squirrel tail, the best, just like hodgepodge across the West, put them together into this top ranked mix. Everybody's great at surviving from seed. Done. Or you could do this top ranked location, right? So like, okay, Peavine Low is pretty great. We're going to put that in the drill. Then this next one, I don't even remember, I can't see that, it's too small, right? We're going to take the top 2 best ranked communities. Number 3, you could just randomly assemble a bunch of seeds that we don't know anything about, which is honestly what we do in restoration, like they're not from the same place. We don't know anything about it. This is very realistic. Or we could just at random pull from these different spots. This is kind of like what they do in Europe when they'll like hay a whole meadow and use that for restoration, right? They're literally taking everything from one spot and moving it together. So think about these. Which one do you think is gonna be the best sort of restoration mix? And think about it in terms of ecosystem services, which is not how I tend to think about the world. But we decided to think about, for the first time, really like productivity and the ability to keep out weeds as our desired components. So yeah, so now you've picked, I think I'm with you, that's what I thought. We were fully wrong, I gotta forewarn. And Allison, so what she did was she took these mixes, different kinds, two of these, four of these, put them in these giant barrels and grew them for 2 years. If we put them in the field, everything dies, so it's really sad. This is like our attempt to be kind of realistic. So she grew them for 2 years, she invaded them with cheatgrass, and then we measured above ground productivity and the ability to suppress cheatgrass of this community. And what we found, again, completely not what I expected. I expected that top ranked mix, would be super great at keeping out cheatgrass, but these top ranked locations, there would be like some sort of magical history of co-evolution such that they're very finely dividing the resource and they're using up every drop of water in here due to this long history of interaction and niche separation that we would predict is happening potentially in these landscapes. And that these random mixes would sort of be awkward, fight each other, and maybe leave room for cheatgrass. That's what I thought. That's what I wrote in the grant. So what we found, I'm going to just show you two things, that biomass and the ability to keep out weeds. So anything random, like plants that had no evolutionary history, is in a cool color. And the single locations are in these warm colors. So this sort of teal is our favorite top ranked mix, like the one that we thought was, the best of the best mixed together. And then this pink is our top ranked location, right? That pea vine spot. And what you can kind of see is that, you squint, the mixes are actually larger than the sort of warm colored sort of single locations. This is not a huge effect, but it's sort of not what you would expect if you've been this like really finely dividing up the niche using all the resources and being large. This is not that pattern. The one that again knocked me off my chair was this. So this is cheatgrass biomass, your ability to keep out weeds. This means you're not keeping out weeds. This means you are keeping out weeds. Do you see the colors here? These random mixes of plants that have no history of interacting with each other are doing a bang up job of keeping the weeds out, while these, even our top ranked locations, the places that have the ability to survive with cheatgrass, are doing an unbelievably terrible job at suppressing it. And this is not subtle. This is a barrel full of some community that's doing badly. This is all cheatgrass. And this is a community that's doing great. And when I walked out here, I was like, Allison, are you sure you invaded like everybody? And she's like, no, I invaded everybody. Some of these barrels, weirdly, the mixes that are completely isolated populations coming together for the first time are doing an unbelievable job at keeping out. You tell me, right? Like, what is going on? So I'm going to come back to that. We can figure out what traits help individual species survive. There are some differences and some commonalities. And the evolutionary history of the restoration mixes matter, but not in the way we thought. If you simply do all this work and assemble these sort of top sources or top locations, that does not lead to this community outcome that one might desire. There's no evidence that a history of co-occurrence leads to some sort of greater resource use, which I think we would all expect. Instead, we find that mixes from, these are not just randomly assembled mixes, they're all kind of similar habitats, but they have not co-occurred before. And that is a really effective way of weirdly keeping out cheatgrass. So next steps, I will say that we're humbled and we want to keep thinking about this. And I'm super excited to talk to the Hallett Lab about this because as mentioned, we don't think about communities and we don't think about them this way, but I am just quite confused. Things I'm thinking about, we have looked at combinations of traits, like are there particular combinations that work pretty well? And what you can kind of see is like, nope, there's all kinds of ways to be fabulous, right? Sometimes there's a really large POA, sometimes there's a really large sagebrush, sometimes everybody survives really well. Like there isn't, it's always possible to explain why a community is doing well, but it's not, it's very idiosyncratic. It's not predictable. It's explainable, but it's not predictable. We've only looked at traits of these like 10-day-old plants. Maybe if we looked at characteristics of actual 2-year-old plants, we would actually be able to find some traits that actually do predict, keeping out cheatgrass. I have no idea. Again, this was a giant blue barrel, not in the field, so maybe we're describing dynamics that are like sort of weird and only come out in this artificial scenario. It kind of makes me laugh because, well, remember how I kept telling you I wanted to know why, I didn't just want to know what? Maybe, we could just try mixing some stuff together, putting it in a drill, putting it out in the landscape and seeing which mixes perform the functions that we want, and then try and explain it later. But what we have demonstrated is I think there's a lot of potential for sort of creating different ecosystem services depending on the genotypes of different species in your mix. So I don't know, it's kind of nuts. Very interested in talking about that. So the Great Basin, it is quite a beautiful place, but it has a lot of problems. I am not naive to the scale of this problem. Poor Bryce here is not naive to the scale of this problem. It's super challenging. I'm not ready to walk away yet, but I'm not naive about how hard this is going to be. We have a huge native seed partnership in Nevada where we're a bunch of us from different agencies, universities are pulling together to try to get the seeds we need, but it's going to be a lot of work. And I would love to thank all of these funders, fabulous students, lots of undergrads, and marvelous people who did a lot of the work that I just showed you. And I would like to thank all of you for being here in person and not falling asleep on Zoom. And with that, I'd love to take any questions if I have time. Okay, Lauren, you're at the top.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
I can, yes.
That was great. So I have to think about the community side more, but I was kind of wondering about how to implement the findings from the first half of the talk. And particularly, I would imagine, if you're in the desert, you win or you die. So there's a very strong selection pressure for the traits to survive. But then if you're actually trying to talk with seed growers and they source from the desert, but they're going to want to water and, get as much production. And have you looked at how fast you get selection occurring in that environment? Like how often do they need to recollect or hit their crops with a drought?
Yes, that's such a great question. And we took our best seeds of squirreltail and thurbers, and we gave them to BFI natives, which is up in Washington, and they are growing them out for us to ask this question, right? What are the potential for selection and maternal effects and drift in these fields? Even if we find these amazing things, can we sort of water it out accidentally? Anna Bukarova in Germany, so she just did a study of, I want to say it's 18 different species that she put through agricultural increase for like 4 to 5 generations because she is out of control, wonderful. And she saw drift and or selection over time, leading to what you might think, sort of erosion of diversity and changing of traits. But the magnitude of that change was nothing relative to the magnitude of difference of using the wrong seeds. So I cannot wait for her to publish this because I'm just going to cite that and be like, well, Anna said it's okay. So, drift does happen, but it's not as bad as using the wrong seeds, right? So, yes.
Cool.
Yeah. Yes, go ahead. I'm not sure how, yeah.
So I'm like really interested in like their big difference or desire to do plugs in restoration. I don't think look at all the money wasted in seed drills. Like, could you let that plug and then?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think there's a lot of interest in that, especially for like shrubs and perennials. If you put one plug in the ground, sagebrush, it's going to make you 1 million seeds in 10 years, right? So yes, that may be $100 plant, but it's going to keep making seeds. And so I think that there is, especially for sagebrush, there are efforts to transplant that one because it's so valuable and so fecund. I've never seen anyone suggest grasses, plug planting grasses, but it works really well. Forbs plugs work really well. It's more the scale of it always scares people. And so this concept of restoration islands, where you spend a lot of money in a small place, and then seeds can move from that with some really smart placement of that island, would be great. Agencies don't change very fast, though. Someone needs to do an experiment to demonstrate how well that works, and then maybe, right? We could change. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Oh, let's see. It's so cool to hear the native species like the squirrel-tail evolved to outcompete cheatgrass. How big is an area or region where the native species already outcompete it? Is it getting bigger? What is the future prediction? How is the genome? That's a lot. I will say it's kind of sad that we're losing these spots faster than we can find them. One of our amazing locations that we found, it actually burned already again. Once these things burn for like the 4th or 5th time, they're kind of gone. So it's kind of a race against time at this point, honestly. So yes, we have not sequenced the sort of original versus survivor seeds. So I don't know if anyone wants to do that. Like find a restoration practitioner near you, right? Grab their seeds, look at the seeds coming in and the seeds surviving. I think it would be a great question. Yeah. Biddy, I can see your hand here at the top. But now you have to find your unmute button.
Unmute. So my question has to do with grass seeds. So you're finding that the bigger ones just don't do as well as the smaller ones, but it sounds like it's more of an intermediate size that does better.
Yes.
I'm just wondering if this is at all correlated with germination rate, that the smaller seeds get a film of water on them sooner and they're able to germinate quicker because of the size.
Yeah, I think, or maybe they have a different seed coat thickness or something we haven't measured, right? I think there's a lot, and that there's a trade-off there with maternal provisioning, I can imagine, right? Like, why would it be bad to have a big seed? It's sort of hard to understand that unless there is an interaction like you're suggesting, right, with timing. And so one of my current PhD students is doing this very fine-scaled measurements of individual seeds and their characteristics and the timing of germination. She's actually going to do this hilarious 24-hour like sleep in the greenhouse, look at her plants every 4 hours, because squirrel tail germinates so fast, like you're kind of going to miss the variation. So she's going to do this hilarious greenhouse sleepover and see how seed size, seed coat thickness, embryo size affect germination time, and see if we can, yes, find, is there this sweet spot where everything comes together, right? Yeah, because yes, it's very, to me, a little bit counterintuitive. All I can think of is these are selfers, and there's a lot of correlated traits. So it's hard to know what one is actually promoting survival. Yeah, great question.
Thanks.
Yes. Great, let's do that.
So is the burning in the Great Basin, is that a new thing with climate change, or is there any history of like cultural burns from indigenous or
Yes.
natural?
Yeah, the question is about the history of burning in the Great Basin. And yes, there is a history of cultural burning, and it would typically keep the inner space very open. And that, like one of the first pictures I showed you, where there was that like complete understory of continuous cheatgrass. In areas that are in really good shape, there's a lot of space between plants, just completely bare inner spaces. And they're actually hard to light on fire when they're in good shape. And so the historic burning was probably every 10 to 15 to 20 years to allow that litter to build up. And there's this amazing positive forward response to fire. Like after fire, it is just gorgeous for about 5 minutes. And then it's cheatgrass, right? And so the forbs have clearly evolved with fire. it's spectacular for them. It's just now we have this grazing situation and this weed that's kind of disrupted it. Plus, people have no appetite for controlled burns in this particular setting. So, yes, that's a great question. Like many things, we interrupted a flow, and it's hard to work back. Yeah.
Given the time, maybe we should.
Yes.
I was saying, given the time, maybe
Yeah,
we should
yeah.
like do, yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Great. Thanks to all of y'all. Thanks all for being in the audience. So nice to have smiling faces. I'm assuming they're smiling.